evening. It is Justice Pakacha, Dr. Ayala Pakacha, Professor Weiler, friends from abroad and from Israel. I and Dr. Yossi Nehushtan, who is over here, who are joint organizers of this conference, want to welcome you very warmly to the Concord Center and to the Chaim Strix School of Law. I'll say a few words afterwards, but I'm going to immediately hand over to our dean, Professor Yoram Rabin, to welcome you in a break between classes. Students have first priority. There is freedom maybe from religion, but not from students. And he will be joining us again tomorrow. And I wanted to say that in this law school, we have a tradition of loving our deans. And this is our new dean who's just taken over, and he's started very well. He's an old timer, I'm prepared to say, and it looks as if the tradition is going to continue. So with that, I am going to introduce Professor Rabin.
Good evening. Excuse me, I'm between classes, so I will leave immediately afterwards. I'm especially delighted to welcome Justice Ayala Pakacha, who has only recently retired from the Supreme Court. Her judgments on freedom of conscience and freedom from religion have been among us the most penetrating and courageous in the court system. It is, as always, an exceptional pleasure to welcome back Professor Weiler, who is an old friend of our law school and who never fails to engage and stimulate us with his ideas. On this occasion, he comes as an advocate for European countries who were defending the rights to exhibit in schools the symbols of their traditional culture in the form of the crucifix. Justice Ayala Pakacha and Professor Joseph Weiler are our key speakers this evening. It is also a great pleasure to welcome our guests from the United States, Denmark, Sweden, UK, and Italy, as well as our Israeli colleagues. The topic of this conference, freedom from religion, is not well-trodden ground in the international or constitutional literature. Though the right to freedom of thought and consciousness are included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights alongside the right to freedom of religion, there has been little focus on freedom from religion at the international level. In Israel, in contrast, there is much discussion of the religious coercion, and the right to be free from religious coercion is the topic of which headline news in our local environment. The imposition of personal religious law by the state and the attempts by powerful religious activists to segregate men and women in public spaces, including the army, and to prevent the inclusion of images of women on billboards have placed the issue of freedom from religion high on the agenda. The reaching out for a wider view of the implication of freedom from religion in other contexts that our own is of particular interest to our academic legal community and to 15 of our students who are participating in a seminar of secular constitutionalism, in which they will listen to the sessions of this conference and write seminar papers on the topics raised. This is the first time we in the law school have combined a conference and a seminar in this way. We wanted to give our students to take advantage of the opportunity to absorb the thinking of the excellent group of academics, intellectuals, and religious leaders on this issue, which reaches into the heart of the Israeli democracy. I want to thank Professor Francis Radai and Dr. Yossi Nehushtan of the Concord Center for organizing the conference and bringing such a distinguished group of lecturers together. The Concord Center was established in order to integrate international human rights law in legal discourse in Israel, and this conference is highly pertinent to that aim. I'm sure that The 3 days of discussion in this conference will produce a fruitful intellectual discussion of an issue which is becoming ever more crucial in the era of human rights law. I wish all of you a pleasurable stay with us at the Chaim Shtrix Law School and an interesting and memorable stay in Israel. I hope that your visit will be one of many to come. Also, I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate Francis for her nomination as a member of the HRC, a Human Rights Council, working group on discrimination against women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Yoram. And well, why a conference on freedom from religion? It's on freedom from religion in Israel, because actually religious coercion and religious extremism are on the rise in Israel, and we'll no doubt be returning to that issue. But why a conference on freedom from religion in what we thought was an age of secular rationalism? I think one of the big surprises for me in my career is learning that I don't actually live in an age of secular rationalism. Why a conference on freedom from religion when the world is facing economic, environmental, and tribal disasters and warfare? Why a conference on freedom from religion when there seems to be little intrinsic harm in religion as part of mysticism? Mysticism which is part of the human psyche. We don't all have to be mystics, but mysticism doesn't necessarily cause any problems. I don't think we and the people who are participating in this conference are here to join Richard Dawkins in his endeavor to show, to debunk the God delusion as a belief that is as ill-founded as a teapot orbiting the earth. He's welcome to his opinion, and those who believe in teapots orbiting the earth don't do much damage, in my opinion, and believing in God as such does not seem to me a project that I have to take on as some kind of knight in shining armor to contest it. Indeed, there's much sociological research that shows positive correlation between religious belief and mental health and physical health and social cohesion. In other words, there are benefits in religion. But what makes me then one of the organizers of a conference on freedom from religion? Because the reason that we are organizing this conference is not because we want to tackle the basis for individual beliefs or freedom of individual belief, but rather the impact of religious institutional power and regulation on legal and social organization. Most of us are lawyers or constitutional lawyers, some legal philosophers, but what we are interested to see is the impact of religious institutions and norms on legal and social organization, both in the public sphere and in the family. It is apparent that with the comfort of religion comes a socio-political price tag. The word price tag is very unfortunate in the Israeli context these days. Those who understand, understand. But religion comes with a socio-political price tag. Religious sects provide, in the words of sociologist Richard Fenn, a haven against social and cultural change. They defend the eroding authority of the family, sacralize ethnic loyalties, and provide barriers against rationalized educational techniques and scientific explanations of nature. That is a price tag. There's been a resurgence of religion as a factor in the formulation of political and social policy, leading to books such as Micklethwaite's God is Back. As I say, for my generation, this was rather unexpected, and it is not only in Israel. We can trace this in various regions: the rise of Orthodox Christianity in Russia and Eastern Europe after Perestroika, the rise of Islamicism in the Middle East and Asia, in Iran after the Shah, and Afghanistan after the Russian invasion and departure, and now perhaps in the Maghreb countries' Arab Spring. Closest to home in Israel is the rise of Jewish orthodoxy's demands for conformity with its creed in the public sphere, especially regarding segregation of women and girls in education, even in state religious schools, not only in private religious schools. In government conventions, there have been conferences held by government ministries in which there's been segregation between men and women. And there has been a conference held by a Haredi, an ultra-Orthodox Jewish organization, which was attended by the Minister of Finance and from which women were entirely excluded, even journalists. There is segregation on bus routes which serve the religious population. It has been contested. The Supreme Court has ruled against it partially, but with an exception saying if women want it that way, then there may be segregation. The segregation de facto is continuing after the Supreme Court judgment. Well, maybe to give a lighter touch to this rather black picture, our current story has it that a Haredi man was sitting on a non-segregated bus, and a girl in a miniskirt got onto the bus and came and sat beside him. And he was appalled. But he said nothing, and he took an apple out of his bag, and he gave her the apple. She was surprised. She said, "Why an apple?" And he said to her, "Before Eve bit from the apple, she did not know she was naked." Well, the following week, the same Haredi is sitting on the bus, and the same girl in the miniskirt gets on the bus. And she sits down beside him, and the bus starts, and she takes an apple from her bag, and she gives it to him. And he says, "Why are you giving me an apple?" She says, "Because until Adam bit from the apple, he didn't know he had to work by the sweat of his brow." So that is a very local representation of what is going on here. The impact of religion on constitutional human rights is very different. We've got all the regions, but very different in different political contexts. In countries with secular constitutions and legislation, there's a variety of arrangements. It's not all laïcité and separation of church and state. There are some countries which encourage religious activity. But all these secular constitutions stop short of embedding religion in their constitutional and legal systems. They stop short of that. So when in Israel people say, what is the harm of having Jewish law, including religious Jewish law, as part of the law of the state? After all, England has the Church of England. Yes, it has the Church of England, but it does not embed canon law in the English legal system. It may have implications. There may be indirect osmosis of ideas or import of ideas, but canon law is not embedded in the English legal system, and similarly with the Scandinavian Church. Susan Bayer contrasts these secular states with our region, basically. States which establish in their constitutions religious law as being superior, and she cites Muslim states, ranging from Egypt to Iran, a Jewish state like Israel, or the Catholic state of the Vatican. Now, I agree with the concept, but of course between those three groups of states there are real differences, really more than shades of difference. There are complex differences. The Islamic republics and the Arab republics, which include the Sharia law in their constitutions, are truly theocratic states. Israel is a non-secular state, because though it has Judaism, Jewish and democratic in its basic laws, it is not anywhere inscribed that Jewish in that context means religious Judaism, Jewish law. So we do not have that in our constitution as yet, and I'm looking at the younger generation here. Make sure that we never get it in our constitution, please. On the other hand, what we do have, which makes us a non-secular state, is the personal religious law, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, written into our legal system. And that makes us a not purely secular state, a not wholly secular state. The Vatican, of course, has canon law written into, or ecclesiastical law written into its city constitution. Whatever the variations, the fundamental nature of the self-declared clash between the establishment of religion in the constitutional and legal order with human rights is clear. It's clear from the reservations entered by the states which are not purely secular to the human rights treaties. They enter reservations in order to prevent the applicability of human rights guarantees in a way which will conflict with religious norms. In other words, what they do is they protect religion from violation by human rights, rather than protecting human rights from violation by religion. And this is an unacceptable paradox, of course, for those of us who believe in human rights, since they became part of the international environment. A primary impact of this immunization against human rights, is the preservation of patriarchy. Gendered hierarchy is a basic tenet of the three monotheistic religions, and one can but quote Susan B. Anthony from the 19th century saying, to no form of religion, of course she was a Christian American suffragette, fighter for women's rights, to no form of religion is woman indebted for one impulse of freedom. And I have not found the exception to that rule. You're supposed to have an exception to every rule, but I've not found an exception to that rule. In addressing freedom from religion, we are not denying freedom of religion, but are concerned to negotiate the balance between freedom of religion and freedom from religion. Freedom of religion is well recognized by proponents of human rights and democracy, but freedom from religion is considered a contentious phrase. And it's interesting that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's freedom of thought, conscience, and religion in that order. But it doesn't say expressly freedom from religion, though that is the way it is interpreted, for example, by the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Committee. Dave Kretschmer is here. He will no doubt talk about it during the conference, Professor David Kretschmer, who was a member of that committee. It is the nexus between freedom from religion and freedom of religion which is to be explored in our conference. Tolerance of religion or tolerance by religion. Prevention of discrimination against the religious or prevention of religious discrimination. Prohibition of religious defamation or preservation of freedom of expression. The rule of religion or the rule of law. All these dichotomies are arising more and more forcefully in the current age. Well, in this exploration, I'm only putting the questions. I am delighted to welcome our wonderful guests who come both from varied geographical contexts, North America, Europe, Scandinavia, and not least Israel, as we've said, and from the varied disciplines of international and constitutional law and of philosophy. I want to thank the United States Embassy and the Frederick Newman Foundation for their generous support for this conference. And I want to give special thanks and appreciation to the Concord Center's Administrative Director, Tali Levy, who has been amazing. What do they call? Awesome. That generation, your generation calls it awesome, I think. The generation sitting in the back row, she's been awesome. And she has done all the coordination of the conference and done it with constant good humor and intelligence and made all the arrangements necessary to get us together. And I want to also thank Yasmin Cohen, somebody has to tell her she's not here, who worked far beyond the call of duty for this event. Well, I am delighted to introduce, my goodness. I am delighted now to introduce our guests of honor in the opening event. We are greatly privileged to have two speakers who've combined intellectual and academic excellence with legal activism. Now then, that's another key word in Israel, a catchword. I am using legal activism in the way it should be used, in the positive sense of the word, the absolutely positive sense of the word. Not over activism, just activism. That is to be involved in the world of human rights. Each has made a contribution to the evolution of judicial decision-making on freedom from or of religion. We are in an academic conference. Not everybody was picked because they are necessarily proposing, in the way that some of us think it should be proposed, freedom from religion. There will be both kinds of views expressed here. Well, I want to start off with Dr. Ayala Prakacha, who, and then I'll introduce Professor Joseph Weiler afterwards, to guests. So Dr. Ayala Prakacha has served for 11 years on Israel's Supreme Court, but her contribution didn't start only there. From her first days as a judge in the Jerusalem Magistrates Court, Justice Prakacha, then Judge Prakacha, never hesitated to give highly principled rulings on controversial issues. The first example of such a ruling was striking down Jerusalem's bylaws which forbade the opening of cinemas on the Sabbath. She struck them down on both grounds, the grounds that they were ultra vires, and they restricted the individual's basic right to choose the way in which they spend their leisure time. What I tell my students always not to dream of doing. There we go. Oops. Now then I have to find how to turn it off, which I have managed. Well, it shows that it's all not all been we didn't have a dress rehearsal. I'm really sorry. Well, I remember those days. They're often cited as the days in which Judge Prakacha raised the ire of the ultra-Orthodox, but people forget to say they were days in which she raised the optimism of the secular in Jerusalem, who have since mainly fled. But there was quite a population of us in Jerusalem there who were out cheering for that decision, together with Ornan Yakutiel, who I think was the protagonist in the case. In the Supreme Court, Justice Prakacha went on to make further judgments which promoted the guarantee of human rights in the context of regulations based on religious considerations. Questions such as prohibition of employment on the Sabbath as the weekly Sabbath as the weekly day of rest, extension of exemptions for army service for women on religious conscience grounds to other ideological or political grounds, state funding of non-compulsory activities such as daily prayer in state schools, and the authority of the rabbinical court to prevent the departure from Israel of a non-resident husband because he refused to grant his wife a get. She has in all these cases tackled that balance, and she's going to share with us her experience from the bench and as a member of our conference. Thank you very much for coming. It's a real delight to have you here. I want to say one other thing before I introduce her, that it is a matter of great regret to us that she's just retired from the Supreme Court and we're not going to go on getting her judgments on an ongoing basis. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Adai. Professor Rabin, I see, has already left. Professor Weiler. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here today, and I wish you all a most interesting and a fruitful conference on one of the more complex dilemmas of human life. The issue I chose to discuss involves the tension between freedom of religion and freedom from religion as reflected in the character of Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. Israel is a constitutional democracy It is featured by two main characteristics. First, the rule of the majority based on free elections and governmental institutions operating under principles of separation of powers. Second, a system of basic individual human rights protected by constitutional principles. Though we do not have a full-range written constitution, basic human rights in Israel are protected either by basic statutory laws and maintain supreme normative status, or by judicial decisions of the Supreme Court. These two combined features lie at the core of Israeli democracy. They protect the rule of the majority on the one hand, and they assure the rights of individuals and minorities from the coercion of the majority on the other hand. Being a democratic state does not fully describe Israel's political, social, and legal regime. Besides being a democratic state, Israel is a Jewish state. In the Israeli Declaration of Independence, it was declared that Israel is a democracy of the Jewish people based on the rule of the majority and the protection of human rights. This dual feature of the state of Israel as Jewish and democratic is emphasized all along our basic laws dealing with the supremacy of human rights. It is reflected in the general scheme of statutory and judicial norms. The basic concept underlying the Jewish feature of the state being the land of the Jewish people, where Jews from the diaspora will gather and realize their historic national bond with their ancient homeland. The Jewish character of the state combines ancient Jewish heritage with modern values of Zionism. This combination of Jewish and democratic elements lie at the core of the value and governmental system of Israel. It distinguishes Israel significantly from other democracies in the world. Our political structure, as well as our legislative and judicial systems, are marked by this dual character of the state. It has direct bearing on questions relating to freedom of religion and freedom from religion, being the two facets of the basic individual human right of freedom of conscience and belief. There is intrinsic tension and at times direct contradiction between the democratic and Jewish features of the state. Being a democracy, Israel's constitutional system protects freedom of conscience and belief and the right to personal autonomy of the individual. From these basic rights emanate the freedom of religion and freedom from religion. However, being a Jewish state reflects upon the weight given to the right of freedom of religion. How does this coincide with the right of the secular individual to freedom from religion? How is the natural tension and at times the collision between freedom of and from religion being reconciled, if at all, in view of the dual features marking the Israeli social, political, and legal structure? Is it at all possible to reconcile basic constitutional human rights to freedom from religion with the Jewish character of the state? Is it possible to combine them harmoniously? These deep and complex dilemmas have occupied the Israeli society since the foundation of the state more than 60 years ago. I will take a brief look at how Israeli law and courts have dealt with the inherent tension between freedom of and from religion in the dual-featured system of the Jewish and democratic state. First, it is important to note that the Jewish element of the State of Israel is a combination of national, Zionistic, and Jewish religious features. The national Zionistic element is reflected, for example, by the idea of the right of return of every Jew to the land of Israel, by the Hebrew language, by Jewish culture and Jewish education. However, the singular history of the Jewish people in the diaspora created a fusion between Jewish nationalism and Jewish religion to become inseparable ingredients of the Jewish entity of the state. Consequently, since the institution of the state in 1948, basic elements of Jewish religion have penetrated into the legal and judicial structure of the state. Religious bodies were given legal authority to regulate religious life in Israel. Restrictions as to work on the Sabbath by Jews were imposed, and similarly, public transportation and operation of theaters and movie houses on the Sabbath were prohibited. Limitations on the selling of pork meat and selling of chametz on Passover in public places were imposed. Beyond these, statutory law imposed Jewish religious law of the Torah on matters relating to marriage and divorce of Jews in Israel. The deep penetration of religious elements into the Israeli legal system was made possible by the political structure of Israeli governments throughout the years, which are coalition governments, including the religious parties, and due to a status quo agreement between the coalition parties from the days of Ben-Gurion, and this agreement affects the political interrelations up to now. The Zionist national features of the Jewish state has not created as a whole a direct clash with the basic human rights of freedom from religion. However, where the Jewish character of the state transforms into normative rules that maintain coercive power upon the secular public and imposes religious directives binding upon one's private life, a forceful collision arises that requires balanced solution suited to a multicultural society. At times, even without religious legislation and administrative rules, a clash between freedom of conscience and belief and the right to exercise religious practices arises. The constitutional values of our system are called to formulate inventive solutions to complex situations of rights collusion and offer a proper balance between the contradicting individual interests in face of the Jewish and democratic elements of the state. Basically, the Israeli judiciary aims at harmonizing as far as possible between the Jewish and democratic character of the state. It searches for common values that can reasonably balance between the two, but that cannot always be achieved. Part of the difficulty lies in the social political structure of Israeli public, and part lies in the difficulty to break deep social and legal norms that have been rooted in the Israeli life for many generations. Changing them demands a deep social reform in concept and in attitude, and can hardly take place successfully without them. In this complex situation, the court's contribution to the balance between freedom of and from religion is noted mainly in areas governed by administrative actions and bylaws of local authorities, less so regarding primary legislation of the Knesset, which reflects the complex multicultural social and political streams and trends of the Israeli society. The majority rule and the concept of separation of powers reflecting upon the democratic system restrains the court's ability to intervene in primary legislation imposing religious directives on the public at large, non-religious citizens included, as long as inner social change has not yet taken place. However, the court contributes to the mitigation of this tension by legal means of interpretation and creative decision-making aimed at bridging the gaps and conflicting values existing in this area. Israeli society is featured by multicultural communities, both religious and non-religious alike. They emanate from the singular historic past of the Jewish people in the diaspora and the democratic concepts of the Israeli regime based on freedom of belief and personal autonomy. Heterogeneous social texture, as such, is bound to create multicultural and religious clashes. The court endeavors at drawing the borderlines of these communities' relative freedoms by creating a value system based on balance and proportionality. The starting point is that basic constitutional rights of freedom of and from religion are not absolute rights. In an organized multicultural society, one cannot achieve full protection of his basic right without encountering a conflicting basic right of another, calling for constitutional protection as well. The judicial solution to this conflict is found in the balance formula, which evaluates the relative weight of each conflicting basic right and searches for the point of balance between them. This balance formula sets the framework for defining the relative constitutional protection given to the various basic rights in concrete situations. This formula is being applied where conflicting individual rights are involved, or where a conflict between a basic human right as freedom of religion and a contradicting general public interest of some sort arises. The Jewish character of the state plays a part in the balancing process as described. Some of the typical examples descriptive of the clash between contradicting basic human rights have to do with the observation of the Sabbath as part of the Jewish religious belief. It also reflects upon the general Jewish character of the state. In Israel, there has never been a question as to the right of an observant Jew to observe the Sabbath according to his belief as part of the freedom of religion bestowed upon him. But what about a secular individual who wishes to spend his Sabbath according to his own belief and lifestyle, to drive on Shabbat, watch television, go to a restaurant or theater, and make use of public transportation? In one of the well-known constitutional cases, an administrative order to close a main route for transportation on the Sabbath was judicially contested. The court was called to reconcile the clash between two basic human rights: freedom of movement of the individual to drive within the city on the one hand, as against freedom of religion and religious feelings of the community living in the vicinity to the route. The balance formula was being utilized, the outcome of which was that an absolute prohibition on car transportation throughout the Sabbath day could not be upheld. On the other hand, the religious feelings of the community involved had to be considered as well. The court therefore directed the administrative authority to limit the closing of the road to prayer time only during the Shabbat and no longer. The decision was based on the rationale that not every action which offends religious feelings of the community or the individual justifies the full limitation of the contradicting basic constitutional right. Only an offense to religious feelings of a major kind, which goes beyond the reasonable tolerance that any individual or community are expected to endure in a democratic society, will justify the full constitutional protection of freedom of religion in derogation of the conflicting right of movement. On the other hand, the secular public ought to respect, up to a certain point, the religious practices of its neighbors and bear reasonable limitations on its right of movement on the Shabbat. In the late 1960s, a question arose as to whether Jewish character of the state may legitimize the imposition of general prohibition on television programs on Shabbat. The court dismissed the petition aiming to impose such prohibition based on the notion that offense to religious feelings cannot justify administrative intervention in private autonomous life of an individual within his home. An offense to religious feelings is unavoidable up to a certain extent in a pluralistic society, and a balance is required between conflicting beliefs and lifestyles in a free and democratic society. Up to the late 1980s, bylaws of local communities prohibited theaters and movie houses from operating on Shabbat. This is the case that Professor Radai referred to. Criminal indictment against an owner of a movie theater was struck down in court on the basis of lack of authority of the municipal body to pass a bylaw administrating the religious life of the community, lacking a specific authority to do so by primary legislation. At the same time, it was held that a balance between religious feelings and autonomous rights of the secular individual calls for the opening of recreational facilities on the Sabbath for those who choose to spend their day of rest in such manner. However, it was held that such rights are to be exercised so that recreation facilities and activities will not be held will be operated in reasonable distance from homogeneous religious communities to prevent undue interference with religious practices and feelings. Conflicts between freedom of religion and contradicting secular mode of life arose with regard to the selling and consumption of pork meat in local communities. The limitations on selling of pork meat emanate from religious motives, and they infringe on the individual freedom of occupation of the merchant and on the personal autonomy of the secular individual to consume food suited to his own taste. The decision of the court, based on the balance formula, determined that legitimate limitations on the selling of pork meat should be based and conditioned upon the character of the local community in question, considering its residents' religious beliefs and lifestyle. Communities that are dominated mainly by secular citizens cannot be subjected to such limitations. In communities which are predominantly religious, selling of pork may be prohibited. Allowing selling of pork meat in such communities may offend the religious public's feelings and beliefs beyond reasonable endurance to be expected in a democratic, pluralistic society. It is interesting to note that the court certified the constitutionality of the law prohibiting work of Jews on Shabbat, stating that its basic dual goal, the social and national values, coincide with the essence of Israel as a democratic and Jewish state. The general prohibition of work on the Sabbath is considered not only a religious directive, but mainly a national feature of the Jewish state, uniting both religious and secular people under a common day of rest. This does not stand in contradiction to the right of every individual to spend his day of rest according to his own belief. However, the state has not rendered as yet the full means necessary to the non-religious community to exercise its rights, as for example, operating public transportation and opening all recreational and cultural institutes of public interest on the Shabbat. Conflicts regarding freedom of belief are not limited to religious and secular convictions and lifestyles. There is tension between the various branches and streams within religion itself. A forceful controversy arose when a group of women belonging to a Jewish reform movement were denied by the Orthodox authorities responsible for regulating prayer arrangement at the Western Wall from praying there according to their own special style. A conflict between the rights of worship of the reform group and the feelings and religious practices of the Orthodox community arose. Forceful emotions and reactions created strong tension in the area. The court decided, based upon the balance formula, that the reform group is to be allowed to pray in the Robinson Ark in the vicinity to the Western Wall, but not at the wall itself. In so balancing, the court gave way to the right of the worship of the petitioners on the one hand, while it gave weight to the general Orthodox religious feelings and practices of the majority praying regularly at the wall, relating also to considerations of public peace and security in the area. The essence of this judicial balance has remained in public controversy up to this day. As you see, the main theme in balancing between conflicting basic rights pertaining to freedom of religion and from religion is found in the search for the point of equilibrium, where freedoms may be relatively protected in a reasonable way within pluralistic, multicultural society. The mode of balancing and the outcome of this process remain many times in deep controversy, both within the court itself and in the public at large. Drawing the borderlines of the freedoms of the multicultural communities depends not only on the balance between individual rights of freedom of religion and freedom from religion, but also on the balance required due to the tension existing between freedom of religion and contradicting important public interests. Realization of the public interest may demand the limitation of the individual freedom. Freedom of religion and religious worship may conflict with needs of public order and security. Situations of the kind call for balancing as well and have brought about the use of the close likelihood formula, meaning that only close probability of occurrence of grave damage and public peace will justify the limitations of basic human right to exercise freedom of worship and religion. The claim of a group of petitioners to worship on Temple Mount in East Jerusalem was denied for many years due to security and public order hazards, creating strong security tension in the area. Limitations on freedom of religion are manifested in other areas of Israeli life where general public interests are involved. The Israeli constitutional system recognizes the existence of basic human rights. At the same time, society cannot function without the commitment of its citizens to fulfill civil obligations owed to the general public and the state. Freedom of religion cannot justify the exemption of a large segment of society from giving its share to compulsory military service, which applies to every young citizen of Israel. The constitutional value of equality, both as a human right of the individual and as a general public value, does not allow the discrimination between religious and non-religious citizens in respect of fulfilling the civil duty. Social and political processes brought about the reality whereby thousands of young people of the Orthodox community do not give their share in the military service, claiming that studying the Torah in the yeshivas is their main goal in life, and military service would stand in breach of their deep religious spiritual commitment. On the basis of constitutional principle of equality, the court has decided years ago that the members of the Orthodox community are obligated to take part in the compulsory army service on equal terms with the secular sector. The dilemma as it stands today is how to implement this legal constitutional obligation and bring it to full realization, taking the forceful opposition of the Orthodox community to abide by this legal directive, and considering the objective difficulties that emanate from the long years segregation that have drawn Orthodox youngsters studying in the yeshivas far away from Israeli modern social reality. This issue exemplifies the deep difficulty in challenging complex social phenomena with legal tools which are not always sufficient and efficient. Another general public interest that may act as a limiting factor of the freedom of religion involves the social need of a connecting linkage between the various multicultural communities in the Israeli society. Without this connecting linkage, society would soon become a system of segregating congregations operating under broad freedoms protected by physical and cultural barriers and having no reference and no relation to one another. The need for a connecting linkage is manifested both in the cultural, spiritual area as well as in the physical aspect of the community's lives. A good example is education. Respecting freedom of religion, an independent religious educational system has been widely developed in Israel, side by side with the national educational system. The extreme Orthodox schooling system does not include in the curriculum general basic studies as history, geography, literature, sciences, and the like. Pupils of the Orthodox schooling system are not exposed to the general human intellectual creation and are unequipped to challenge realities of life in the general Israeli society. Such pupils are gravely affected, and their rights to equal opportunities in life are severely harmed. Moreover, without a cultural linkage between the various multicultural communities through basic education, social cultural harmony cannot be achieved. The court ruled that Orthodox educational systems are obligated to incorporate general core studies to their programs, denying those who oppose the receipt of public funds. Recent statutes has been passed by the Knesset legitimizing financial public support to Orthodox schools, notwithstanding their decline to incorporate core studies to their curriculum. The constitutionality of this law is now pending before the court. The need for a connecting linkage between segregated multicultural congregations is manifested also in the need to break through physical barriers that separate communities from one another in the residential neighborhoods. Physical seclusion of homogeneous communities, either religious or secular, affects negatively the efforts to create a healthy, harmonious society. Lately, the court dismissed a petition of a secular community opposing the construction of a religious public building in their neighborhood, claiming, among other things, the right to freedom from religion. The court decided that freedom of or from religion does not justify congregational physical segregation under the auspices of constitutional values. The necessary linkage between the multicultural communities demands mutual concessions as expected in a pluralistic society ruled by democratic principles. Free movement and interaction between religious and secular neighborhoods should be permitted as long as law and order are respected. These are several examples reflecting the way by which the Israeli constitutional system balances conflicting rights and public interests, drawing the borderlines of protection giving to freedom of and from religion. The main theme in doing so is to achieve balance between conflicting rights and public interests so that every individual and every community, be their belief what it may be, and every important social, national interest may find its relative recognition and relative place in the general life scheme of the society. This balance will rarely bring about absolute protection to any right at the expense of the other or of a general national interest as such. Every right and interest should find its relative status in the general scheme so that balance will be achieved between rights and values as between democratic feature of the state and its Jewish content. One cannot sum up this presentation without relating briefly to the difficulty posed by laws concerning personal status matters in Israel. The law which states that marriage and divorce of Jews in Israel are governed by religious law was enacted soon after the institution of the state, and a special rabbinical judicial system was instituted to adjudicate these matters. The legislative act concerning marriage and divorce gives absolute value and weight to the Jewish religious element of the state, leaving no margin of freedom from religion, and as such, to the democratic nature of the state. This reality has caused grave problems to Jewish couples who, for some reason, the halakha prohibits their marriage. It affects mixed couples that cannot marry within the country in legally valid ceremony. It creates grave problems concerning conversion of non-Jews to Judaism. Various streams within Judaism itself struggle against the Orthodox monopoly in managing all religious matters in the country. In this complex situation, people's personal fates are greatly affected, and so far, full remedy to solve these difficulties has not yet been found. The court has tried throughout the years to mitigate these harsh consequences on individual rights resulting from the imposition of religious law in marriage and divorce. It recognized the right of Jewish or mixed couples who got married abroad in civil ceremony to register their marriage in civil population register. Though this does not help validating the marriage, according to Jewish law, it enables the couples to achieve some social recognition accompanied by certain social rights. Court decision has also broadened the rights of non-Jewish residents in Israel to undergo conversion process in a recognized Jewish congregation abroad. In certain respects, the Orthodox monopoly in supplying religious services in the state has been weakened by judicial decisions which struck down prohibitions on women and non-Orthodox individuals from participating in religious bodies in local communities. The Israeli constitutional system has not yet found a balanced solution to the imposition of religious law on Jews regarding marriage and divorce of Jews, giving no weight in this area to basic human rights, freedom of conscience, and freedom from religion. This issue involves a complex social and political reality, the change of which can hardly rely on legal and judicial tools only. There is need for reform in the basic social concept regarding the law applicable to marriage and divorce, a reform that will find its way to the legislation and bring about the essential change. So far, the social political structure in Israel has not come close to finding a common denominator needed for such change. The question as of now is, what are the limits of the court power to reach a justful constitutional balance in this area, taken the deep controversy and taken the formal constitutional statutory immunity given by basic laws to all legislation, including the law of marriage and divorce concerned. This complex question has not yet been answered. One may sum up by saying that the constitutional democracy in Israel is basically based on duality between its Jewish and democratic nature. This duality is singular to Israeli constitutional system and distinguishes it from other world regimes. In general, there is a constant effort to reach harmonious balance between the democratic and Jewish values underlying the essence of the state. However, this harmony has not yet been fully achieved. In many walks of life, a reasonable balance has been obtained between freedom of and from religion by using various criteria within the balancing process. But there is still a long way to go, especially with regard to the basic fundamental right of the individual to personal autonomy in family life and in other areas as well. where proportionate balance has not yet been achieved. The way to achieve the change is not easy. It requires the understanding that the Jewish character of the state does not depend on the religious elements that are coercive and foreign to the non-religious community, being a majority in Israeli society, but rather on the deep Jewish heritage based on its ancient history and its rich humanistic culture, accompanied by various Jewish symbols, all of which mark the singular features of our people. But religion and constitutional norms speak different languages, both genuine and deep. One is a language of belief, and the other a rational humanistic language based on constitutional principles. The bridge connecting these languages to one another is hard to build. In a Jewish democratic state, in the realm of personal belief, freedom of the individual should be recognized based on mutual respect of another's belief and mutual balanced concessions through proportionate accommodation to general needs and interests of the society. Israel is the national homeland of the Jewish people, and at the same time, it is a democratic country committed to the protection of human rights. The full harmonious combination of these two basic values lying at the core of our state has not yet been fully achieved. Thank you.
Well, I think that we heard a very fascinating presentation of the dilemmas that face our Supreme Court justices, and hearing the view of these things from the bench shows the difficulties with which Supreme Court judges in Israel have to deal on a daily basis in dealing with our constitutional framework. I'm now going to introduce Professor Joseph Weiler, who is very well known to faculty here, and he is a professor at NYU, the Joseph Strauss Professor of Law and European Union John Monnet Chair.
You know what I'm going to say now.
And no, stop. You're going to stand up and you're going to come and talk instead.
Say my mother is not here, so...
Okay, your mother's not. As a matter of fact, he's absolutely right. He speaks for himself far better than I can speak for him. And so I'm going to let him talk about himself, the Lautzi case, and he's going to answer questions. So there'll be time for questions and comments afterwards. It's a great, great pleasure to have you here, Professor Weiler.
Thank you very much for inviting me. We were talking about, is it Justice Prokacha? And Professor Adai and distinguished Dean Rabin. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to come to this place. One, I could have just said, as you often say in your decisions, I agree with my honorable friend, etc. I concur, and we could just get to the discussion, because there's very little in what you said with which I disagreed. And I think in such an inflamed issue, it was reassuring and educational and uplifting to hear the serene, balanced tone that you took in navigating through these difficult issues. And lawyers are about justice, and justice is something that we should be passionate about. But also the lawyery profession is also being dispassionate in order not to replace our own personal passions with those of justice. And this was a very wonderful example of this. I found both the tone and the judicious judgments you described impressive, and I don't think I would differ There's one thing I would differ, and I will come to it. I didn't like at all what you said, and I didn't like at all what Professor Radai said when you juxtaposed, on the one hand, secular rationalism or rational humanism on the one hand, and religious belief on the other hand, as if religious belief cannot be rational and cannot be humanist. It's a deep prejudice which, coming from other people, not from you, I would say borders on bigotry, but this is not the case here. But it's still something we should think about. So it's a difficult debate. Why is it a difficult debate? First of all, it's almost invariably passionate. People feel very strongly about these issues. It goes sometimes to their own ontology. Very often it's mixed with personal experiences. If it's in the Christian world, with experience with priests, with childhood, etc. It's to do with our own sense of legitimacy. Am I really a Jew? What does it mean to be really a Jew, etc.? So it's a debate characterized by passion. It's a debate characterized by mutual contempt very often. Deep down, many religious people, not all religious people, have a measure of contempt for secular people. They're missing out on something. And the contempt of secular people towards religious people was palpable in the room today. These irrational, how can they even be part of our conversation? One of the big impacts of Rawlsian analysis. And if it's not quite so contempt, then it's a shade of that, disrespect, and one finds it very difficult in this kind of debate to actually live up to the value of pluralism, tolerance, which one professes. One uses the language of pluralism and tolerance, Akol Kol Yaakov, pluralism, etc., and then one comes out with positions that are anything but pluralist, anything but tolerant. Often I have found that the most illiberal people are the liberals, and especially in this debate between on the place of religion in our public spaces and our private spaces, that tends to be the case. It's an empirical observation of the nature of the debate. And I don't think that I'm straying very much from an accurate description. It's very local. It's a very local debate. In what sense? When I'm in Tel Aviv and we're talking about the general relationship between religion and the state, it's Judaism that's in the air. And one generalizes from the particularity of Judaism into general propositions of how we should think about this. And when I'm somewhere else, it's Christianity or Islam, etc. But in some ways, these are very, very different religions. The very fact of lumping them together, in some respects, not only leads to error, to misconception, to misunderstanding, but the sign can also be a sign, all these religious people, they're all the same. But they're not. They're not all the same within the Jewish experience. They're not all the same within the Christian experience. I know too little about Islam to talk about that with any kind of authority. And there are also fundamental differences between, say, Judaism and Christianity, two religions I know quite a lot about. Here's a fundamental difference. Christianity is universal. It has a history of intolerance towards the other because in its universalism it wants to believe that everybody, the only way to salvation is through Christ, so by hook or by crook one has to accept Christ. Whereas in that respect, Judaism, which is not a universal religion, in fact it defines itself by its non-universality. Tem tiyu li la'am v'ani elchem le'Elohim. So it's not interested. It's not only not a universal religion. It has universal values, but it's not a universal religion. But it's not a proselytizing religion. So its illiberal instincts are reserved inwardly. It's not about telling Christians and Muslims or how they have to behave, but its illiberal instincts are turned towards other Jews which do not hold the same view or are not religious at all. But if we try to have an understanding of these things and we just lump religion, freedom from religions, etc., without drawing important distinctions between different religions and different facets of religious experience, we might not quite hit on the target that we want to do. Now, I know that some of you at this point might be thinking, but we are in Israel, so what interests us is the experience in Israel. But the beauty of going outside to one's experience is one can then understand one's experience in a better way. Even in some respects, seeing the awfulness of the status quo here in a clearer light by reference to experiences elsewhere. And there's history. There's history. In Europe, they're still battling the religious wars of the 18th and 17th and early 19th century. And for example, in our attitude towards other religions, we are still understandably, always under the yoke of the history of Jewish persecutions by non-Jews in our history, and which could lead us towards an aspect of we cannot do the same. Ki gerim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim, you must not oppress the stranger because you yourself were oppressed. But it could also lead us to the opposite tendency. Finally, we can live our religion without oppression as sovereigns in our own country, etc. So history here has to be taken into account, how we perceive the problem, how we understand the problem, how we chart our way. Now, what I want to do, I want to add two things, come closer to home. In some way, and I'm not saying this in an absolute way, but I'm convinced that there's a large measure of truth to what I have to say. In a milieu such as ours, we are hugely, disproportionately influenced by French and American constitutionalism. French because of the heritage of the French Revolution. We are all children of the French Revolution. And the neo-Kantian tradition, which is part of it. And there's an inordinate influence of American constitutional thinking on our legal and political culture for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is because it's in English. But not only because of that, because for decades one looked up to the United States. And if you look at the biography of most of the constitutional law teachers in this country, you will find that they did their master's degree or their doctoral degree in the United States. And I can go on and on about it, but I'm just making an empirical observation. There's a huge influence in our embedded, in our situatedness of we are children of the French Revolution, and in our constitutional public law thinking, the influence, most people wouldn't know the first thing about the Italian or French or German or Spanish tradition of public law. But they will cite chapter and verse when it comes to American constitutional law. Even students in second, third, fourth year classes here. Now this comes with baggage, and now fasten your seatbelts. The first baggage with which it comes is that there is a kind of ideal type. Hafradat hadat ve'miyamdina. The secular state, to separate religion from the state. That seems to be a kind of ideal type. B'medina metukenet, in an ordered state, in a truly liberal pluralist state, like France, like the United States, people should be guaranteed absolute individual freedom of religion because we are pluralist and tolerant, even if they are irrational religious people, not rational secularists, but we can allow them. They can collect matchboxes, and they can create a society that the earth is flat, and they can go to shul on Saturday. You know, we guarantee freedom of conscience because we are in a liberal. But the state should be totally beyond that, above that, neutral, not tied to that. It cannot endorse religion, it cannot support religion, and very often that is our ideal type. Conspicuously absent in what Justice Procacccia was saying. That was not her ideal type. Her ideal type was accommodation. But the geist against in which we operate in this society is that's how it should be, because that's what a medina metukenet is. So I've got news for you. The American and the French situation, France by its constitution, Article 1, France is republic, social and laïque. And laïque is a political theory which says that religion is reserved to the private sphere. And we Jews historically are so attached to the laïque solution because it's through laïcité, through secularism, that we gained our independence. There's a wonderful book by the former president of the French Constitutional Court and his wife, Badinter, called Libre et Égaux, Free and Equal. It's about the emancipation of Jews in France under the French Constitution. And that's why you find in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, Jews are in favor of the laïc state because it's through laïcité that they gain their independence. But it's the exception. The French-American situation is the exception. It is not the rule. It is not a minor exception, but it is not the rule. In what we call, or used to call, Western liberal pluralist democracies, most people live under constitutional orders which are not laïque à la France or à la United States in the way interpreted by the Supreme Court from the 40s onwards. In other words, that's not mine.
I thought I'd silenced it forever, but
even your phone was protesting against what I was saying. But you, Francis, you really need to have a better tune.
Are you referring to the tune of my opening remarks or the tune of the phone?
Both. So in order to move a little bit from this kind of local passion, etc., let's look a bit, that's what we're doing. We're looking comparatively. What do we find elsewhere when it's not Judaism, when it's not Israel, and when it's not the United States? If we look at the European experience, we find the following picture. We find a general commitment in all European states under the European Convention on Human Rights to a guarantee at the individual level of freedom of religion and freedom from religion in the terms explained by Justice Procacccia. And they all have to struggle with that, and I will come back to that in a moment. At the public level, we find a huge diversity. We find, on the one hand, I'm going to drop a footnote. And it's interesting to look at the European experience because it comes under the tutelage of the European Convention on Human Rights. So it doesn't mean that these people don't make mistakes. All courts make mistakes. But for the most part, it kind of gives a hechsher. If it's done and they say that it's okay, it's hard to argue that this is some egregious violation of fundamental human rights. That this is a practice which is accepted in democratic, pluralist, liberal democracies of Western Europe and now beyond the 46 members of the Council of Europe. So what do we find? We find on the one hand states like France where their secularism is built into their constitution, where in fact part of the identity of the state is that it's a secular state, that religion is guaranteed at the private level, but the state has to be not have any religious entanglement or religious identity or endorse any kind of religion. But we have states like Britain, which are just across the channel, where the head of the state is the head of the church. It's as if Nasi Hamedina would be Harav Harashi. Not quite, but not all that far from that. Where there is an established church, in other words, one religion is privileged against all other religion and against laicite. When British soldiers come home dead from Afghanistan, the default burial is a religious burial according to the rites of the Church of England. One can opt out of it, as it would be in a good liberal tolerant society. But the default is a religious ceremony. When Kate and what's his name? William get married, they get married in Westminster Abbey by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who has ex officio. He's a member of the British legislature. In other words, his irrational religious views are meant to be part of the discussion of public law in the United Kingdom. Otherwise, he would not be made ex officio by virtue of his office, a member of the legislature. The national anthem, it's not kolot balevav quite, but it is a prayer to God to save the Queen, give her victory and glory. It's a prayer. It's a hymn which you find in the hymn book. And the flag has the cross. And the flag has the cross. And then between these two examples, you find a whole variety of different religious identities that different states, if it's Greece with the Greek Orthodox Church, or it's Malta in which teaching the doctrines of Roman Catholicism is by law mandated in all schools, although there's an opt-out. And light countries like Germany, whose constitution begins with the words, aware of our responsibility before God and man, God and man, but which is not exactly a laïc state in the French sense, because the Germans do a lot of work on behalf of the churches. They collect money for them. So unless you opt out, a portion of your income tax will go to support the churches. You can decide that it should not, but there is the state in a cooperative arrangement. That's why the German churches are so rich, because the default is that you contribute to the churches unless you opt out, and the collection is of course very efficient because it's the German tax authorities. So we have a whole variety of arrangements which are a little bit like Medina Yehudit V'Demokratit, a Jewish democratic state. In other words, that the state in its identity is not secular like France, but is actually got stronger, weaker, depending. In the Irish Constitution, the preamble talks about the divine Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Trinity, the source of all truth, beauty, and justice. That's in the Constitution. And nobody has ever ruled or held that that is a violation of fundamental human rights or violation of freedom from religion. Or violation of freedom from religion. Now, you might say, how can that be? How can that be? How can it be that a preamble that says the divine Lord Jesus Christ is the source of all beauty, truth, and justice is not in some way an impingement of freedom from religion? So I want to explain this, and part of my explanation is historical, but part of it is of great legal consequence. And I'm going to first explain why it's of great legal consequence. So we have, and we heard brilliantly by Professor Procaccia, the tension between freedom of religion and freedom from religion. In theory, it sounds great. I can go to shul on Shabbat. There should be no law that impedes me from doing that. And you may not go to shul on Shabbat, and there should be no law that forces you to do that. But of course, no fundamental human right is absolute. None. Even the right to life is not absolute. All states I know of, even when they don't have conscription, they reserve the right to recruit people to the army and expect them to die for the patria. So there's no right to life. That is absolute. So all rights are compromised or mitigated or balanced with other competing public interests. So if somebody came and said in Germany or in Britain, yesterday God appeared to me and told me, Kach et bincha et yechidcha asher ahavta, take your son, your only son, the son you love, to a mountain that I show you, and sacrifice him to me, the state would say, well, thank you, but no thank you. We respect freedom of religion, but there are limits to freedom of religion. In some countries, the rules about kashrut and halal, slaughtering, is challenged in the name of not animal rights, but our sensibility towards animal rights. So there are 3 or 4 countries in Europe in which halal and kosher slaughtering is prohibited with the competing interests. So freedom of religion is not absolute. And I hope you will all nod your head and understand that also freedom from religion is not absolute. That in the same way we do not guarantee to the religious person that every time he says religion, he gets a license to do anything that he or she wants in the name of religion, that we do not give a similar type of license that every time the word religion is mentioned, there's a mezuzah on this door. Somebody could come and say, why am I forced to walk into a classroom which has a mezuzah? But I, as a legal realist, predict that if it went to the Supreme Court of Israel, it would take Justice Prokacha and her brethren about 1.5 minutes to decide, walk in, so long as you're not forced to kiss the mezuzah. You with me? But in some way, it's impinging on freedom from religion. My classroom has a religious symbol on it. To all the hate mail I got from Jews after the Lautzi case, in which I defended the right of states to have a cross in classrooms, not an absolute right if you read my pleading carefully and if you read the decision of the court carefully. But reading carefully in the age of blogs is no longer something we do, is it? But everybody, how can the son of a Lithuanian rabbi, Latvian actually, defend the cross? I said, I am willing to answer your question if you will tell me that you would require every Jewish school in Israel to remove the mezuzah. If you do that, then we've got something to discuss. But if not, then why is not the source for the Jewish mezuzah not source for the Christian cross gander? I didn't get a single reply, although I had a lot of hate mail. Incidentally, unfortunately, my wife still does not forgive me. I had to do that case pro bono. 8 countries, Grand Chamber, that's a cool $1 million. Why pro bono? Why pro bono? Because of my heart? Because I couldn't afford for my reputation that 100 blogs around the world would say, look at that Jew, for money he will even defend the cross. It is not a joke. You might find it funny. That is the only reason I did it pro bono. So now to come back to the legal point. So just as there's a tension between freedom of religion and freedom from religion, and nobody can claim to an absolutist, remember? There is going to be a tension between the public character of the state, which is not secular, like a Britain, like a Germany, like a Malta, like a Greece, etc., and the right of freedom from religion. I mean, if a state has a cross on its flag, in some way a citizen can say, why do I'm secular, why should my flag have a cross? So there's going to be a tension there. And it's going to be a different type of balancing. Now, I want to say something which, in my view, but you know, they say originality is simply you haven't done enough research. So I think it's an original point, again, to theory, but maybe I haven't done enough research. So don't embarrass me in public. If you know that somebody has said it before me, send me an email. It's quite okay. I believe in freedom of speech. So historically, how do we find a cross on a flag, or God Save the Queen, or the divine Lord Jesus Christ, etc.? It's because in the world of European nation states, the nations understood their identity very often tied up with religion and religious symbology. Take Ireland. It is impossible to understand Irish nationalism. It is impossible to understand the concept of the Irish nation devoid of Catholicism. A great deal of their war for centuries against the British was, we are Catholics ruled by Protestants. That's what it was, and the Brits, until this century, oppressed the Catholics quite badly. So even if you're a secular Irishman or woman, even if you're Harav Rashi Israel Herzog, who was a Rav Rashi Ireland before he came to Israel, he would understand what is Irish nationalism. He would describe it, of course, Catholicism is an indispensable part of Irish nationalism. Now the legal point. Usually, and I think Justice Procaccia, I'm going to finish in a minute.
No, I don't. I'm actually thinking you can go on and on from my point of view. It's very interesting.
You're a very dictatorial person. I don't think that they think I can go on and on.
I'm not dictatorial. I'm giving you freedom.
I'm just teasing. I'm teasing.
From my authority.
I'm claiming the right to tease. Listen. So there's going to be a clash between these two things. I described in historical terms, you can't understand the emergence of the Irish nation independently of Catholicism. But now I'm going to give it legal content. Usually, when you do the balancing, and it's not between right and right, but it's between the state, which says, I don't know, no cinemas on Friday, and the individual. You have on the one hand state power, and on the other hand the individual. And that's why we invented fundamental individual rights. And when there's a clash between state power and fundamental individual rights, we give huge deference to individual rights. Our balancing is a bit different. Our midatiyut, our proportionality, is a bit different. In American constitutional parlance, it's not enough to have a reasonable explanation, it has to be a compelling reason. It cannot just be something that no reasonable government would do, but it has to be something that you cannot do otherwise. There really has to, it's a very different game of proportionality. Because we say the state has all the power in the world and the individual is always weak and meek, so our job with fundamental human rights is to ensure that there's no encroachment. When we come to the identity of the state, including its religious identity, I am positing it, and this is the point I'm making, it's not power against right, it's right against right. It's one of the few areas where there is a collective fundamental right, which is the right to self-determination. When Ireland defines itself the way it does, or Britain, England defines itself the way it does, it is exercising a fundamental right recognized in international law to self-determination. And to say to them, you can be an Irish nation, but you cannot be an Irish nation which includes as part of your history, identity, and what you are celebrating in your independence, your Catholic heritage, that would be a denial of their right to self-determination. That would be an encroachment with others, etc. It's not absolute. Because we already said no rights are absolute, so also these collective. Why is it important to posit it in this way? Because when somebody like Justice Procaccia, or the Supreme Court of Israel, or the European Court on Human Rights, or the Supreme Court in any country which is not a France or a United States, is positing the tension that will be between the right of the state to define itself with a religious identity, Kolod Baleva, Yehudi, as against the encroachment of the right to freedom from religion of the individual, it has to be a different proportionality game. It has to be a different balancing game because it's balancing a collective fundamental right against an individual fundamental right. This does not mean that the collective right will always trump the individual right, but it's those of you who are familiar with the phenomenology of constitutional adjudication will know that it will be a different process. different standards of review, different type of argumentation. It will be more like the balancing which we had when we have one fundamental right against another fundamental right. Freedom of religion and gender equality. They can clash with each other. It's a different type of balancing than it just is power against right. Now, how do we do this kind of balancing? When we recognize that we have to talk about two freedoms of religions. Freedom of religion at the individual level and freedom of religion at the collective level. So the first thing, I want to issue a challenge. It is not clear to me, and I'm only being 1% mischievous and 99% serious, how we can justify in terms of political theory the laïc state, the secular state like France. And I want to explain to you why. France is secular by virtue of its constitution. Here is the challenge. We have freedom of conscience. I'm allowed to be at an individual level a socialist, correct? Am I allowed to be a communist? Correct. Now, as an extension of my individual freedom of conscience to be a communist, I also have a fundamental right of association and one of the precepts of democracy. If I persuade enough of my fellow citizens that they should be socialists like me and communists like me, then we can decide that we will change the flag from blue, white, and red to a red flag, because I have a majority. And now there's a majority of us who are communists, we want a red flag, etc. If I was very ecological, if I had enough people who I persuaded to be as green as I am not green. My house in America accounts alone for 2% of global warming. But if I persuaded enough people like me to be green, I could not only change the flag to green, that would be trivial, but I could have the system of taxation in such a way that it would favor green causes and a green society and would disfavor a non-green society. And if somebody came and said, I think all that is nonsense, it's ridiculous, etc., how are you using my taxes to further green policy? We would say to him, that's democracy, my friend. Now, let's go back to the cross on the wall. Every symbol is allowed on the French wall. If they want a picture of Che Guevara, you can have a picture of Che Guevara. If you want a hammer and sickle, you can have a hammer and sickle. If you want a red flag, you can have a red flag. Everything is allowed on the French wall. Every world view is the subject of democratic politics in France. Socialism, vegetarianism, ecological, communism, capitalism, liberal capitalism, higher capitalism. You have enough people which support you. You have enough people which support you, you can make that the policy of the polity. One is not allowed, religion. How do we explain what is the justification for a state? How do we square that with our political policy, political understanding, political theory of liberalism, pluralism, that every worldview is a legitimate subject of democratic politics, but religion is not? So if enough communists want to have a red flag and have a red flag in the classroom, they can in France. But if enough Christians want to, they can't have a cross on the wall. Now Rawls tried to give us an answer. He said, because the politics of religion are not rational, they revelation, etc. That's partly true about Judaism. It's not true about contemporary Christianity. It's not true about, but I know Christianity. No, it's not true about contemporary Christianity, post-Vatican Council II Christianity, etc. They stake their thing on rational discourse, natural. You might not agree with the analysis of natural law. You might not agree on the analysis with rational policies, but you might not also agree with the analysis of the communists or the socialists or the ecologists or the vegetarians. Because you don't agree with them, you don't exclude them from democratic politics. But we do exclude religion from democratic politics. So the onus of explaining what justifies freedom from religion in a laïc state where we started, you remember, I said that's our ideal type, that's our wet dream. We should all have הפרדת הדת מהמדינה, which means religion is a private business, but the state should be above it. It's actually very difficult to understand in terms of our normal democratic politics of religion. At the end of the day, how we come back to Ayala Procaccia, and that's where I end. So both in freedom from religion and freedom from religion, and then the identity of the state as religious and the individual right to freedom from religion, again and again we will have these tensions. And we have to balance them somehow. So one balance would be to say, if the state, because of its Jewish identity, can require a mezuzah on the door, but cannot require somebody to kiss the mezuzah. Nobody should be coerced into a religious act. Nobody. That's why in Israel it's an ongoing scandal which is not known in any Western democracy, that there's no civil marriage in this country. That somebody, in order to get married, has to go through a religious ceremony. Just think if a Jew had to be put through a Christian ceremony in order to marry. That's how secular people are not just absence of religion. For many secular people, it's a rich worldview, as rich a worldview as a religious worldview. To tell, I had to organize to my niece a marriage in Italy, provincia di Firenze, comune di Vaglia, because she, as a matter of conscience, was not willing to go through a religious ceremony, to exercise a fundamental right to get married. So that is, sometimes the line is clear. There's a difference between walking into a class which has got a mezuzah and having to go to a rabbi and go through a religious ceremony in order to get married. Sometimes the lines are much more blurred. If you have an adoption agency which is not willing to give up kids to same-sex couples because they are Catholic or because they are Jewish, do we say then you lose your license to be an adoption agency? If we have an adoption agency which says we are a Jewish adoption agency, we are in the business of giving kids to Jewish couples because the kids we have were meant to go to houses which observe kosher, do we put them out of business? I could give a million examples, but I won't. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
These were two very challenging, very profound, very deep presentations. I am going to waive my comments altogether because I'd like to hear comments and questions from the floor, which will be to Professor Weiler only, because I agreed with Justice Procaccia that she's too close to the bench to want to take questions at the moment. So I open it to the floor for comments and questions. We don't have any comments and questions? I think that maybe if we don't have comments and questions, I will...
We're hungry.
We're hungry. Are we going to give up all comments and questions? Well, I will, in that case, I will make one question. A very firstly, from the bench, I mean, from Justice Procaccia's presentation, as I said, we heard the dilemma of dealing with the problems of the Israeli legal system. When one listened to Professor Weiler, and may I say to you, Professor Weiler, you put, until the very end of your presentation, one couldn't really see a place for freedom of religion at all, freedom from religion at all. You put your case in such a way that religion itself is so unproblematic that it is almost absurd to ask for freedom from it. And when you talk about whether you have a green flag or a red flag or a cross on the walls of a classroom, you didn't say, well, what about a swastika on the wall of a classroom? Whether there are some symbols which people can feel comfortable with and other symbols which people may feel uncomfortable with. And then why would people feel uncomfortable with a cross where they didn't feel uncomfortable with a green flag? Maybe there is something that religions have been doing which make them more problematic, and that is why we require freedom from them. I would have said that much more strongly, except that you yourself, by the end of your talk, put the other, but at the very end of your talk, the other point of view, that religions have been oppressive of human rights in some ways. And when I use the word swastika, I only used it because I wanted to say there are all kinds of different symbols. I wasn't saying green is like swastika, is like the cross, is like the Magen David. I wasn't in any way trying to make that kind of analogy. But what I was saying is that religions, and as you yourself acknowledged towards the end, actually have not incorporated human rights standards in some aspects of their both their ideological and their empirical development. And so my question to you is whether freedom from religion is irrelevant in respect of those religions which have not or do not accept human rights standards.
So, protest as you may, the first example you gave was comparing the swastika to a religious symbol. No, it's a fact. No, it is.
No.
And then one sort of backpedals and said, of course I didn't mean to compare. But it's I find it an ugly comparison. There's some things that we should not just do. You know, when you go into a cemetery, you take your hat off.
Can you, will this microphone? No.
You don't do that.
Just
Please. Not be part of this kind of conversation. So I accept you didn't mean it, but
I did. I meant it. I meant it, but I meant it only in order to show that there is a wide spectrum of symbols. That was not to analogize between one symbol and the other. It was to say there is a wide spectrum of symbols, and what one has to do is to look into the meaning of the symbol in order to decide whether one needs or doesn't need freedom from it. That is all I was saying.
I understand. So let me answer. The most important rationale, I left you, I said I was challenging you, but the most important justification to freedom from religion is religion itself. As I say, to root freedom from religion in the kind of empirical, these religions have been so bad, so maybe we need to protect ourselves from them, is not going to get us very much. If we look, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have died under religious banners in the history of the world. But we look at the history of the 20th century, the greatest mass murderers of our civilization, Nazi Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, and Mao's China, those multi-million, hundreds of millions killed were in the name of secular rationalism, not religion. So we're not going to justify freedom from religion on some kind of empirical analysis. You know, if you look at the history of religion, they are so awful, etc. So let's try and understand why we should have freedom from religion. And we definitely should have freedom from religion. The first justification is from a religious perspective itself. The former Pope, John Paul II, and now echoed by the current Pope, they have always said freedom of religion is the most important freedom. And we could take it as a trade union statement. If you were a trade union thing, you would say freedom of association. But then they go on to explain that freedom of religion also means freedom from religion, specifically the freedom to say no to God. And from a religious point of view, that is totally understandable. A religious person believes in imitatio Dei, following in the ways of God. And a coerced following in the way of God is no following at all. Hakol bidei shamayim chutz mirat shamayim. So to coerce belief in God is an anti-religious act. So first and foremost, freedom from religion is a religious proposition because it denies freedom of religion. A religion which is not professed freely is not freedom of religion, and therefore freedom from religion is absolutely necessary for the religious person. Secondly, one does believe in freedom of conscience. And in the same way that one should not force somebody to be any worldview, a communist, a socialist, because we believe in freedom of conscience, one should not impose on anybody a religious belief or a religious practice. It's self-evident. What I called into question, and I said there was one degree of mischievousness, but as a serious challenge, given the Geist here, is to really try and give a rational explanation why it's okay, a communist which has killed millions and millions and millions, or the depredations of liberal capitalism with the poverty, etc. All those are acceptable within our democratic politics, but the laïc state, the secular state, somehow singles out, and it singles out only religion. If the French Constitution singled out socialism or singled out liberalism, we would not call it a pluralist liberal country. But when it says the state, there cannot be an expression of religion by the state, which means that it's not subject to normal democratic politics, we do not object to that. And I said that is a challenge. There are some answers, and the answers, some of them I already gave now. But we take it so naturally that it is worth reflecting deeply on it. But you won't find me in any way defending or not defending freedom from religion. As a religious person, I would hate to live in a society which didn't protect freedom from religion. And that's why so many of the instances which Justice Prokacha gave me in the State of Israel, where it is not an exercise of a certain part of the population to live a free religious life, but an attempt from that part of the population to coerce others who are not religious to religion, it offends me. It offends me exactly in the way it offends you, maybe even more, because it offends me as a liberal and it offends me as a religious person.
And that is a very wonderful remark. I think that some of the people who were killed as heretics would have appreciated it if the religions had always adopted this view, and not all religions have always adopted this view, if I may say so.
What worldview has always lived up to its
No, I mean today, look, Salman Rushdie is in a modern situation where it wasn't accepted that heresy was fine from the point of view of religious authority. So there are problems. The only thing I was trying to say was that there are problems, and in fact the religions themselves have identified the problems by reserving their commitment to the human rights treaties. But may I just ask David Kretschmidt, I think you said you wanted to speak, Dave. Yes.
Yosef, I'd like to ask you the following question. The First Amendment to the American Constitution, the clear distinction between establishment of religion and freedom of religion. And what I want to know from you is, I mean, you were basically arguing that there's the non-establishment of religion is the exception. You have the United States and you have France, and those are the exceptions. There are many other countries which have an established religion. But is there any necessary connection between the question of whether we allow establishment of religion and whether we would allow any incursions on freedom of the religion of the type to which you clearly object?
Great question. First, it's not the establishment of the prohibition on establishment of religion that makes the United States and France exceptional. It's the fact that their laïcité, in other words, that the state, whether established or not, cannot endorse religions, cannot be entangled with religion, etc. It's the secularity of the state. That is exceptional. Not establishment or not privileging one religion among others is not the exceptional thing. Now look, I'm not a total idiot. Different historical contexts, different religions, different periods call for a different solution to exactly the three tensions that we discussed. The tension that Justice Procaccia discussed between freedom of religion and freedom from religion, which everybody in this room believes or professes to believe in. But there will be cases where one will come at the expense of the others, and we will have to balance. And the second tension that I highlighted, because I didn't have to cover that ground again, which is between the collective right to an identity, and an identity which may include religious elements, and freedom from religion of the individual. So, let's not think a minute about religion. Let's take freedom of speech. You can have a group of neo-Nazis marching in Skokie, that's a neighborhood of survivors in Chicago. And the Supreme Court of the United States, invoking the First Amendment, will protect their right to march and even the duty of the police to protect their march. If the same group marched in Munich or marched in Tel Aviv, they would be in prison within 5 minutes. And we are not going to say that the Americans are wrong or the Israelis or the Germans are wrong. We will understand that the historical context creates a different necessary balance between freedom of speech and a certain public good, however we define it, which leads to one result in the United States and another result, which are appropriate in the political, historical, moral, ideological context of these two countries, or these three countries. Now, the same thing can apply to resolving the tensions in the context of the United States at the time it was established. Given that it was mostly a Protestant society, where huge tensions between Protestant denominations, it made a lot of sense to the framers of the American Constitution to prohibit an established religion, to say that the state should remain out of the fray between struggles between Presbyterians and Episcopalians and what have you. So in that context, it made a lot of sense. I will say another thing without the adductio ad Hitlerum. In Lao Tzu, it was not pleaded by myself, nor did the court hold that in all circumstances it would be appropriate to have a cross on the wall. Somebody might come and say, in this neighborhood, in this locale, in this country, there are 46 members of the European Convention of Human Rights. To have a cross on the wall would be terrible for this or that reasons. And the court said, what the court held, it's a narrow ruling, that in and of itself, simply saying a cross on the wall is never kosher, that cannot be right. So it depends on the context. It depends on the context. And it depends on each one of you, of us, understanding that we are dealing with issues which, as I said, engage our passions, are ontological, who we are, what is our society, and that therefore tolerance comes with great difficulty. Tolerance comes with great difficulty. It's really, one has to be Voltairean. To the other, I got 1,000 emails saying, how could you defend the cross? And I had 1,000 emails saying, thank you for defending the cross. And to every email that said to me, thank you for defending the cross, I wrote back and said, I did not defend the cross. I defended the right of France to be France and of Italy to be Italy. That's what I defended. Tolerance comes with a price.
I want to say thank you very much. self-determination is certainly a human right, and I think a strong argument has been put for self-determination here. I think that was a wonderful opening to this conference, and both contributions, I think, enriched us enormously. Thank you very much indeed.